Hello and very warm welcome to the Ideas Factory. We are almost at the end of the year 2022, and this would probably be our last episode this year before we actually take a break for Christmas, for the New Year's, and we shall meet you in the next year. But as an year ender, this episode, we're trying to look at all that changed in the world geopolitically, strategically, and for India, and how did really India's outreach towards the world or India's role in the global geopolitics shape up? So we will look at some of the important events that took place around the year. There was economic, environmental, and geopolitical turmoil in 2022. Looking at the Russia-Ukraine crisis, the war is still on, which led to a lot of economic distress all over the world. Other than that, of course, the COVID Omicron virus spread and health challenges that were present all over the world. China grappling with COVID now, and Queen Elizabeth passing away. So all that has, in a way, changed the world, the outlook, and India assuming the G20 presidency. A very warm welcome to you, Harsh. I would like to begin with what changed for India after assuming the G20 presidency, or rather its outlook towards the world, or India actually evolving from a competitive marketplace to a leader of the G20 group, and India's geopolitical influence that grew significantly in the year 2022.
Thanks, Naghma. I think, one of the most interesting developments this year, of course, has been how the world is looking at India through a different lens. And this year became one of the key years when that came out into the open. We were looking at this shift towards India and India becoming a critical anchor in global politics. But I think with the G20 presidency, which India assumed in the last month of this year and will continue over the next year, there are now, there's a new responsibility on India today to lead at a time when global order is fractured beyond recognition. And I think what started this year early on, the Ukraine war, in some ways has accelerated some of those trends that were already visible before 2022. But during the course of this year, we have seen those trends solidifying and the great power competition reaching a phase which I think allows India to play that role of a country that can voice the concerns of those that are not represented in this great power contestation, as well as bring all the stakeholders together in some ways as part of its G20 leadership. And that, I think, is going to be a critical development over the next year, over the next few months. Because a lot of the eyes would be on India and how India assumes that leadership role. And of course, there is great expectation. There are many countries have voiced it openly, saying that they expect a lot from India this year. So I think there's also this sense of anticipation that perhaps at a time when multilateral order is not working, when global institutions are not working, then can G20 provide that alternative? I mean, it's a tall order, but certainly given what is happening in other platforms, G20 certainly allows India to lead global agenda at a time when, as you pointed out, there are economic problems, there are geopolitical tensions, and there are bigger issues like climate change on the agenda, which are not being tackled as effectively by the extant multilateral order as we had hoped at one point in time. So I think all that brings India into the spotlight. And I think this is going to be that way a very, very interesting year for India, for Indian foreign policy, and for India's aspirations to play that larger role on global platforms.
And India's foreign policy has clearly evolved and took an independent stand. If we look at Russia-Ukraine crisis, where there was a lot of pressure on India to take a stand against Russia, against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But India kind of balanced between Russia and Ukraine while condemning the war, while saying that war is not an alternative, but also that significant oil deal that happened with Russia. And India withstood the pressure from many Western nations who actually, we saw that there were a barrage of sanctions by the Western nations against Russia for this war that Russia waged against Ukraine. But India's foreign policy has evolved there.
Certainly, if you recall in February, when the war started, there was a sense of doom and gloom about Indian foreign policy. That how will India manage? India will have to make certain choices. India will inevitably will make someone or the other annoyed or angry or displeased. And I think the West initially did try to raise this point with India much more publicly, much more vocally. There was this, explicit annoyance at India trying to, take an independent position on Russia, not towing the Western line. And I think if you look at what has happened over the course of the year, that even as I think the Western media continued to target India on the Russia question, that India is not doing this or not doing that, or India it continues to buy oil from Russia while Russia is invading a sovereign state. I think we have seen how the Western nations themselves, the Western governments, their policy evolved. So I think that what is interesting about this year is that this has been a year when India's relations with the West underwent a certain turbulence because of Ukraine, but at the same time we saw that the trajectory remained positive and upward moving, and India-Europe relations, India-US relations continued to be as strong as they have ever been. So I think that way it has been an interesting year for Indian foreign policy, that India has tried to maintain that autonomous position on this issue of Russia. India has not publicly condemned Russia, but India has also been trying to make a case, I think, to Russia as a friend that this is unsustainable, that the war needs to end. And as Prime Minister Modi's statement, which has been echoed around the world, that this is not the time for war, reflects that India has, Prime Minister Modi went public with this comment. So I think India's position from a place where India was reluctant to publicly condemn Russia and continues to take a position that it will not publicly condemn Russia, to a place where India has insisted on certain norms to prevail in this time of global contestation, is a very interesting arc that you can look at. India is now, and has been saying now for some time, that ultimately it's a question of territorial sovereignty, it's a question of international law, it's a question of UN, and those principles need to be adhered to, even as it has pushed both Ukraine and Russia towards a process of greater dialogue and reconciliation, because ultimately all wars end through political dialogue and political some kind of a political assessment that dialogue is necessary. So I think broadly that evolution we have seen in Indian foreign policy this year, and some very effective and clever balancing by India. But again, as war clouds continue to gather, as this war continues, and we don't know what the winter would bring to us and to the world, I think that the pressure on India will continue to be as significant as perhaps it was last year. But I think India's ability to manage that pressure came into sharp relief this year.
Absolutely. Europe especially faces a very harsh winter now, and rest of the world too. There's been food crisis, there's been energy crisis. Europe especially, and for Ukraine and the area around, it's going to be a harsh winter with that energy crisis. But how has this Russia-Ukraine war changed the geopolitics of the world, Harsh? And we all know that this war, basically, when you talk about dialogue, there has to be a dialogue between Russia and the US, probably, or the NATO. Ukraine is not really in a position to bring an end to the war, and we haven't seen much progress as far as dialogue is concerned. Right now, this war has changed the geopolitics. It has also shifted the focus, the US's focus, from the Indo-Pacific to Europe, probably. So how is this war reshaping the world, or rather changing the equations?
I think this war has solidified some of the trends that we were witnessing earlier. Now, those trends, they were under the surface. They're now out in the open. And one of the most serious concern for India and most important consequence of this war for India and for others would be that the Russia-China axis has been now almost cemented in some ways. And that will have grave consequences for India, for the world, for Europe. And I think that will have to be taken into account by New Delhi and by other interlocutors around the world. But one thing that this war has done is that it has also brought Europe to the forefront of global geopolitics, something that European Union had been reluctant to do for so long, despite America and some countries within Europe pushing for it. Now, I think has become a reality. Germany itself is now increasing its defense budget significantly. Germany is now willing to send its warships, send its fighter jets into Indo-Pacific. Germany, one of the countries which is the economic powerhouse in Europe, is now changing its strategic profile in some very significant ways. And I think, we have seen as a consequence of this war a new awakening in Europe about the challenges they face. So as far as Europe is concerned, this is truly the end of history. This year has really made them aware of the challenges that they face, and therefore this new sense of what needs to be done about it, that there is now war happening on Europe's doorsteps, something that I think most Europeans believed has disappeared after Second World War. But that has clearly not happened, and I think Europe will have to reconsider and is already reconsidering the terms of their engagement with the wider world. And I think in that sense, this is good news for India, because India has always asked that Europe play a larger geopolitical role. And as Europe moves into the Indo-Pacific, as European countries move into the Indo-Pacific, I think this provides for this confluence of like-minded countries working together towards upholding certain principles in the Indo-Pacific. But I think that the concern that many in Asia and many in the Indo-Pacific and many in New Delhi would feel is whether if this war continues, whether Europe would move away from the Indo-Pacific more towards Eurasia and focus more on the Europe threat, rather on the Russia threat, than on the problem that are emanating in the Indo-Pacific. I think that's a genuine concern that is there in the Indo-Pacific. So far, Europe and the wider West and the US are indicating that they are not willing to cede leadership or not willing to cede their roles in the Indo-Pacific. They are enhancing their profile in the Indo-Pacific. They are working with like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific, including India. So I think there is a sense that in Europe that you can't really compartmentalize the conflicts in Eurasia and in the Indo-Pacific, but we'll have to see how that gets operationalized on the ground in the Indo-Pacific in particular. But I think most significantly for India, we have seen this reawakening of Europe as a geopolitical actor, and we have seen the solidification of Russia-China relationship. And that will have great consequences, not only for India, but I think for our partners in the West as well.
And how has China evolved amidst all this? I mean, yes, of course, you're talking about the solidifying of the Russia-China axis. And here there's still a challenge of the leadership role in the Indo-Pacific. The West, the wider West, is not ready to cede that leadership. But China, at the same time, grows in its aggression, and China, Russia coming together increases that threat too. China is also facing a lot of economic turmoil back home. It's also domestic problem. For the first time, we saw there is kind of a revolt against Xi Jinping and his authority, however short-lived it was, but of course it's simmering there. So those challenges, and at the same time, China's larger ambition, how is that shaping up? And the US-China, the turmoil there, the conflict there, the trade war.
I think indeed, again, this year has accelerated those trends that we were already witnessing. But in particular, this year, I think was interesting insofar as it brought out those concerns about Xi Jinping that prevail within China to the forefront, howsoever short-lived, howsoever marginal, howsoever isolated. But the fact that even in the age of Xi Jinping, you have people who are willing to openly come out and either put a poster or demand Xi Jinping's resignation, that's quite substantive in some ways. That it shows that Xi Jinping, despite all his attempts to centralize power, has actually not been very effective as an administrator. And the fact that he had to change course on COVID strategy weeks after he proclaimed very grandly at the 20th Party Congress that how successful that zero COVID strategy has been. And now this sudden U-turn on that strategy and the consequences of that with the Chinese health system falling apart. I think there are signs that all is not well within China and that the leadership of Xi Jinping remains a contested one, and that the protests that we saw this year are symptomatic of a wider dissatisfaction within China. So whether there is economic turmoil, whether there is health crisis, whether there is a socioeconomic inequality, whether there is a dissatisfaction with the Chinese Communist Party leadership, and whether I think there are pushback on the diplomatic front at a number of levels that China is facing across the Indo-Pacific and beyond. All this underscores a very, very limited success of Xi Jinping as a leader. I think this idea that that you move away from Deng Xiaoping's biding your time and hiding your capabilities idea, that has not worked out very well for China. And I think this is really a question mark over Xi Jinping's ability to assess the ground reality and to make decisions. So ultimately, this is a long-term problem for China and for the world. Because what he's thinking, how centralized that system is, and what are the consequences of the system going to be. And this is, I think, in one particular way that this reflects on the India question, where we have continued to see aggression, where we have continued to see a reluctance to acknowledge that there is a problem, and where we have continued to see a reluctance to acknowledge that China really needs to mend its ways if it wants to change this negative downward spiral in India-China relationship. So I think all in all, it showcases a China. This year had showcased a China that is not sure about its own domestic policies. I would say Xi Jinping not sure about what he wants to do with all the centralization of power that is done. And also a sense that his foreign policy is not yielding dividends. Instead, it is making a lot of enemies at the same time, opening a number of fronts. So how does he manage that? And I think India will have to be carefully watching this. And of course, what happened just this month at the Tawang border also underscores that a 19th century problem or a 20th century problem continues to impede Sino-Indian relations in 21st century, and also impede in some ways India's aspirations to play a larger global role in the 21st century.
And of course, it creates enemies. The China's foreign policy, like you said, is yielding more enemies than any result that China would be hoping for, or Xi Jinping would be hoping for. Coming to the end of this episode, but a last question of there are many changes also that are taking place in US. We've also witnessed a midterm election where some significant changes took place. How is the US domestic policy and its foreign policy shaping up? And if you look back at the year that was, going forward now, the war that continues, what can we expect, and the effect that that is now felt around the world of the Russia-Ukraine war and the US's role there?
I think one thing that we found out this year that perhaps Mr. Trump's role in American politics might be coming to an end. The losses that his allies faced in the midterm elections and the better than expected results that the Democrats got in these elections showcase a certain fatigue with Mr. Trump, even within his supporters. And I think the rise of an alternative power center within the Republican Party that is willing now to more openly challenge Mr. Trump after the string of defeats that his allies have faced. So I think it seems to be a new beginning as far as the Republican Party is concerned in the US, and we will see over the course of the next 1.5 years how that pans out. But I think this has been a consolidation for the Democrats, and I think they have heaved a sigh of relief with the midterm results. And in some ways, Mr. Biden himself, whose leadership has been questioned repeatedly. His polling numbers have been abysmal throughout the year, but now they have picked up. And I think much would depend on how he handles the economic recession that seems to be coming, that seems to be part of the global economic discourse. But I think on the larger question of leadership, also global leadership, also he faces a question, which is what to do with the Ukraine war. And I think there again there are many in the US and many in Europe that are asking for some kind of a political dialogue to start, and they are asking that the war aims of Ukraine that have been now defined as maximalist in their orientation need to be redefined. But I think it will be a conversation first between Ukraine and Washington, and Ukraine and NATO, and then between NATO and Russia. And that's how it's likely to evolve over the course of next year. At the moment, I think everyone is waiting for the winters to end. Ukrainians feel that on the battlefield, they have momentum. So they have very little incentive to negotiate at this point. And the Russians feel that winters are going to be harsh if they can continue to bombard the civilians and the energy infrastructure of Ukraine, and hopefully push the morale down to a level where the Ukrainians themselves will demand some kind of a ceasefire or some kind of negotiations. So I think at this stage, it's very unlikely that we will see any significant developments during the winters. But certainly everyone is waiting for the winters. Once winters end, then there might be an opening for some kind of a dialogue, depending on what the battlefield realities are. But I think this has been an extraordinary year in that sense, in which whatever you say about Ukrainian strategy, what it has shown is that a small country has challenged the behemoth like Russia frontally with support of the West, of course. But I think the morale has been very high in Ukraine, and the desire to contest Russian aggression has been quite remarkable. So I think this year, certainly, if at all it goes to anyone, it goes to the Ukrainians, being the underdogs in this war, in this conflict, and is standing up to Russians throughout the course of this conflict. It's quite a significant achievement in and of itself, whatever the ultimate, I think, consequences or the ultimate result of this war is. But by and large, quite remarkable year. When we began this year, we were not talking about the possibility of a war. We were saying that it's simply what Mr. Putin is doing is simply to have a better diplomatic negotiations with the Europe, but ultimately it ended up in a war, and a war that continues and is likely to continue over into 2023.
Absolutely, hoping that it ends soon. And when, like you said, when the year began, we were all grappling with, and the world was grappling with the challenges of COVID and actually looking at a health crisis. But then there was an additional crisis with the Russia-Ukraine war. And as we come to the end of it, there's still no solution to that war that's causing effect. People, countries that are already reeling under the effects of this war, hoping that the new year brings in some good news and that settles down. Thank you so much, Harsh, for the analysis of the year that has gone by. And that's it from us on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Now we shall see you in the new year. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.